Okay, good morning. I like this lesson 101. Whoa. God's will for me is perfect happiness. Um, Within this lesson contains a little bit of what I was trying to get at yesterday and possibly sort of muddied the waters too, but let me read the first paragraph and maybe you'll understand or where I'm coming from with all of this. That's not necessarily means that's where everyone needs to come from with all of this, but it's just my understanding that I can express, and that's all I'm really giving you is how I've come to understand this and some of the ways in which I got there. Actually, some of the communications from beyond space and time that came to me, some of the lessons within the world of space and time that I was fortunate enough to live through. And it is true. God's will for me is perfect happiness. And the perfect happiness comes from doing God's will. All joy comes from doing God's will. And all sickness, pain, suffering, death comes from the strange belief that there is actually another will. But let's read this first couple paragraphs for a second, and maybe I'll be able to get a bit into what I was trying to say yesterday about the idea of salvation being so closely tied to Christian establishment and crucifixion. So closely, because of the Christian establishment and the need to maintain, in a sense, in a sense, some sort of way of controlling. At a certain point in time, religion is the opiate of the people, and the attempt to enforce morals operates at a very, very deep level. So today we will continue with the theme of happiness. This is a key idea in understanding what salvation means. It certainly is, because the experience of being saved is definitely an experience of joy that really does passeth the understanding of the ego, and true salvation, the salvation that comes to you in the experience of recognizing who you are in the midst of this illusion of who you are not, relieves you of much of the sense of repression and suppression and the need to maintain moral codes that are enforced by others, as if they have the ability to adjudicate and therefore alleviate you of your sins. Today we will continue with the theme of happiness. This is a key idea in understanding what salvation means. You still believe it asks for suffering as penance for your sins. There you have it. This is not so. You must think it's so while you believe sin is real. And that's the crux of the problem. The belief that sin is real. And somebody must have done something or be doing something that requires punishment in order for others to be safe or saved. That's why the crucifixion looms so heavily on many of our hearts. There's a residual of it. I think Jesus discusses that in the Course in Miracles. The residual of the crucifixion looms heavily on our hearts because, in one sense, all of this is happening, all of this is done by memory. And the memory is in all of us. because the memory is in the world, so it's got to be in all of us. We share the same mind. If sin is real, and that God's Son can sin, the idea that God's Son can sin against the Father, or against himself, or against anyone, is an indication that we need to be cautious. We need to exist in a condition where we don't allow ourselves to be true to the self that we're feeling inside of us, because we never know what that sin is, because the sin is so nebulous. One man's poison is another man's dope. If sin is real, then punishment is just and cannot be escaped. Salvation, thus, cannot be purchased but through suffering. And so we attempt to suffer through our days and be good enough to warrant salvation. And in order to do that, we must look out and see things that don't warrant salvation in order for us to be able to have something to judge whether we warrant salvation. And so someone must sin, so sin must be real. If sin is real, then happiness must be illusion. That's true, for they cannot both be true. Exactly. The sinful warrant only death and pain, and it is this they ask for. They know it waits for them, and it will seek them out, find them somewhere, sometime, in some form, which evens the account they owe to God. They would escape him in their fear, and yet he will pursue them, and they cannot escape. And, okay, for me, there is no better descriptive paragraph than those to describe the condition I was in when I finally had to abjectly surrender because I could not take living in that state of mind anymore. It was just not possible. It was intolerable. Death and hell seemed like a better idea, or a better, in a sense, fate than the fate of living that way. And so I just gave up. I gave up. Couldn't do it anymore. If God was going to get me, he was going to get me now or later, and he was going to get me because I was a guilty sinner. I had no idea how not to be that. There was no amount of confessions that I went to that alleviated the guilt that was deep inside of me, and it all felt fraudulent. So when sin was real to me, salvation seemed like it was painful. And pain is the cost of sin, and suffering can never be escaped if sin is real, and that's the way it was. Salvation must be feared, for it will kill, but slowly taking everything away before it grants the welcome boon of death to victims who are little more than bones before salvation is appeased. Its wrath is boundless, merciless, but wholly just. Luckily, none of this is real. Zero, none of the condition that we find ourselves in space and time is real. It is in reality. These ways of thinking do not exist, nor do you think that way and experience yourself that way in reality, which is why this is not reality. This is an illusion of reality, and we have become lost and enamored by the illusion rather than being dedicated to what we are, which is God's love in extension. And this nagging idea that exists within us all, that at any moment we could be cut down because of something we did that we don't understand, and so we try to avoid doing something we don't understand how we do or not do, and that dynamic lives deep within each and every one of us, torturing us slowly. And the more we act to justify that thinking, the greater the torture becomes, and the closer and closer to sickness, suffering, and the ultimate death. And I'm sure he'll deal with it somewhere, and the fact that we are pursued beyond the grave. we're pursued beyond the grave. Not only do we die, when we die, we have to be judged, and then we will get our just rewards. I couldn't live that way, personally. I could no longer live that way. I just couldn't. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm weaker. I don't really know. All I know is I couldn't live that way. I couldn't put my finger on it. I just know that if this was the way my life seemed to be going, God was going to get me sooner or later. I couldn't afford to put off God getting me any longer, because I'd rather burn eternally in hell than live in this condition of not knowing any longer. And in that moment, there was salvation. There was Jesus waiting with his arms open, as he's waiting for everyone at that moment in themselves. Everyone has this moment in themselves. I don't know the degree, and I'm not judging anybody's degree to exist in this moment, because when it dawns on you, even conceptually, that this is the way it is, and the concepts that you're reading about what sin and salvation is in these first few paragraphs begin to match up to the feelings that you have been experiencing within yourself, and you begin to realize, oh my God, this is why I've been feeling this way all this time. The willingness and the ability to turn to one who does know, because we so obviously don't know, is right there waiting in that instant, and has always been waiting for each and every one of us there in that instant, and that is the instant where salvation is available to us. There is no sin. You need the practice periods today. The exercises teach sin is not real. Now, the idea that we've been mistaken becomes obvious. The idea that we have been mistaken becomes obvious in this lesson. Because if this is the way we have been thinking, then obviously we've been mistaken about everything that's going on here. Not just a little bit of it, but everything. We've been totally mistaken, and in the willingness to allow ourselves to be totally mistaken, the totality of a correction is made available to us. And that's what's really funny. So obviously when he says, we wonder, sometimes in the Course he'll say, well, it's an error in thinking. You've been mistaken. This is what all the error stems on. This is what all the error stems from. Obviously, if sin is not real, then this way of thinking is entirely mistaken. And we need a correction for all of it all at once, not just piecemeal, giving up little bits that we think we're mistaken about. We're mistaken about the entire system of thought that allows the perception of the fact that we need salvation from something that isn't real. That's the correction we need. It's the correction I needed. And if you're like me, to any degree, that's the thing. Doesn't matter what degree. You're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. You buy a little bit of it, you bought it all. The exercises teach sin is not real, and all that you believe must come from sin will never happen, for it has no cause. Now, the interesting thing about it is, if you look back objectively upon the lives that you've been leading and the history of the world of space and time, you begin to get an idea of what's been going on. The exercise teaches sin is not real, and all you believe must come from sin will never happen, for it has no cause. There goes all your churches and all your church establishment trying to mitigate your sins. The mitigation that they offer is actually entrenches you more in the reality of sin, thinking that when you confess them, you're getting rid of them, rather than when you confess them, you're professing your belief in sin, rather than your profession of faith in an eternal loving Father who sees you and created you beyond the ability to sin or be guilty at all. Accept atonement with an open mind, as if you could accept it with a closed one. I think there, as I read that, I think what he's alluding to is the idea that we conceptually like the idea. So we'll say, oh, I accept the atonement for myself over and over again. But we accept it from the point of view of still thinking that sin is real. And accepting the atonement is going to make up for the sins that we've committed, rather than the recognition that in the open-minded condition of accepting the atonement for ourselves, the recognition that none of this has been real, so there's never been such a thing as sin, dawns upon you. It's not a concept, it's an experience. Accept the atonement with an open mind, which cherishes no lingering belief that you made a devil of God's son. No lingering belief in an illusion that something can alter what God created, changeless and eternal, whole, perfect, infinite, and only loving, and only lovable. There is no sin. We practice with this thought as often as we can today because it is the basis for today's idea. And establishments don't want that to be true because they think that in the truth of sin existing, the ability to control people's behavior occurs, rather than seeing if everyone had the experience. Instead of offering the experience of sinlessness and the guiltlessness of the Christ, which would immediately usher in a time of brotherhood and love, because that's what it is. And in a condition of brotherhood and love, there wouldn't be a thought of lack, need, someone taking something from somewhere. Jesus once told me, I'm talking about locking my cars and stuff, and he said to me, listen, you really have to trust the Christ in your brother and allow a space and time in which your brother recognizes your trust of the Christ in him. Why would anyone want your stuff if we all have been given everything equally? That's the question. And the second question would be, why, if he's your brother and you love your brother, would you deny your brother anything that you have? Why wouldn't it be your greatest joy to give him what you could in order to help him along the way? And if there is only love, and you're trusting that your brother can respond to only that idea, you're offering him a new space and a new time that's clean, that's been cleaned and empty and made free of the thought that sin exists, and holds you in the purity and innocence of the guiltlessness of the light of Christ. If you don't do that, if I don't do that, this is what you say. Hey, if you're not going to do that, there's nobody who's going to do that. If nobody's going to open their mind and begin to think that way, then certainly, and the requirement is someone must. This is what I was trying to get to yesterday about desire. This is what I began to desire. I didn't know how to do it. I just knew I desired to meet the conditions necessary for me to be the one who was responsible for my own salvation and the salvation of the world. I have no idea how I'm going to do that, but I know it's true because I have been saved and I've recognized the world is saved. So it was my job to offer the world a place in which they can experience what I came to experience, and unless I met the conditions wherein which that was true, there was no one else to meet those conditions. And I want it to be true because it is true. Sin is not real. You cannot sin against your father. You can only fail to think correctly and think that there's a mistake that needs to be corrected. And the totality of the mistake is this. So obviously we've had an error in our thinking. Just let that error be total and all-encompassing so the correction can likewise be. And you'll know God's will for you is perfect happiness, because there won't be any contradictory will or anything to interfere in your mind with the accomplishment of that will. There'll be no contradictions. There'll be no compromises necessary. There will only be the perfect joy and the continuous, ever-flowing reality. And that is who we are and what we are. God's will for me is perfect happiness. It must be His will for you as well. But how else are you going to discover that will unless I make room for me to know it and discover it and allow you to discover it as well? And this is what Jesus is doing for us. He's holding the truth of who we are inviolate in His mind and His heart and allowing us to discover it for ourselves, because it's the greatest discovery you'll ever make in your entire life here. And as a matter of fact, it will show you what life is and the fact that you have not been living life. You've been avoiding death. You've been avoiding the punishment for sin that you think you deserve. And you don't deserve that punishment because sin is not real, nor is the death that seems to come from the belief in it.